Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. This is the story of the American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history, when the fate of an entire country was at stake. Why did the United States split in two? Why did slavery become the point of no return? How did a nation that had proclaimed liberty find itself on the brink of dissolution? In this video, you will learn how the Western territories became a battleground between the North and the South. How one man, Abraham Lincoln, became both a symbol of hope and a threat. And most importantly, why even after formal victory, the war was far from truly over. We will tell the story of those who made history and those whose names remained behind the scenes. The first teachers, soldiers, and former slaves who gained the right to vote for the first time. This is not merely a chronicle of battles. It is the story of a nation that survived catastrophe and tried to reinvent itself. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States of America was a young but already deeply divided nation. In the North, industry was growing rapidly. Railroads were being built, factories, banks, and universities were opening. The Northern economy was based on wage labor and free trade, and social movements such as abolitionism were gaining strength. The South, however, remained agrarian and dependent on a plantation system whose foundations were tobacco, cotton, and sugar. The key element of this economy was slavery. Millions of black men, women, and children deprived of freedom turned into property and passed on as merchandise from generation to generation. This contrast between North and South was not merely a difference in lifestyle, it became the source of mounting hostility. In the North, more and more voices declared slavery a moral evil incompatible with the ideals of democracy and a free society. In the South, slaveholders and their allies not only defended their right to own slaves, but often justified slavery as a so-called natural order, necessary for stability and prosperity. As early as the year 1820, political tensions between North and South had reached such a level that Congress was forced to accept a temporary arrangement known as the Missouri Compromise. Its essence was this. On all new territories north of the line 36 degrees and 30 minutes, slavery would henceforth be prohibited, with the sole exception of the state of Missouri, which would remain slaveholding. This solution, which seemed reasonable at the time, calmed disputes for a while without solving them. It merely postponed the inevitable clash of interests and principles. The problem was not only geographic. The United States was expanding rapidly. After the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, the annexation of Texas, and especially after victory in the Mexican War in 1848, the country gained vast western lands. But these were not yet states. They were federal territories without their own governments or clear status, and every time one of them approached statehood, the same question arose. Would slavery be allowed there? At first glance, geography seemed to give the answer. Why not let southern lands become slave states? But there was no law that automatically defined a state's status by its latitude. The question had to be decided separately each time, first by Congress and later, after certain reforms, by the settlers themselves. Thus, each new territory became a political battlefield, where both North and South struggled to preserve the balance of power in the Senate, where every state had an equal vote. In this fragile equilibrium lay the seed of future upheaval. Pro-slavery advocates feared that the North, with its growing number of free states, would eventually dominate the Union. Opponents of slavery, in turn, sought to prevent its spread. Hence, westward expansion, which seemed a blessing for the young republic, turned into a field of political and ideological warfare. By the middle of the century, tensions had become so severe that former compromises lost all effect. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act changed the rules completely. It repealed the old Missouri line and introduced a new principle, popular sovereignty. From now on, settlers of each new territory would decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. That meant the fate of every new state would depend on who settled it first. So began a new and anxious era. Streams of settlers rushed into Kansas, some from the North to found free communities, others from the South to defend slavery. Violence followed them, arson, skirmishes, and killings. Kansas became a miniature Civil War zone, a grim preview of the nationwide conflict to come, a period forever remembered as Bleeding Kansas. One of its darkest episodes was the raid led by the abolitionist John Brown, who, together with his sons and followers, attacked a pro-slavery camp and killed 5 men. Later, Brown organized a failed attempt to spark a slave uprising by seizing the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He was captured, tried, and hanged. To some, he was a martyr. To others, a terrorist. A major cultural turning point came with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Its author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, depicted slavery through the eyes of the enslaved, their suffering, humiliation, and broken families. The novel caused an enormous stir. Northerners saw it as revelation, Southerners as slander. It is said that when Abraham Lincoln met Stowe, he remarked, "So this is the little woman who started this great war." Perhaps apocryphal, yet the saying perfectly captures the impact her book had on public opinion. Meanwhile, political tensions grew sharper. In Congress, both houses fought for control. The South feared losing its power to block anti-slavery laws, while the North feared that slavery might spread to all new territories. One of the South's main arguments was the doctrine of states' rights, the belief that each state had the sovereign authority to regulate its own affairs, including slavery. Southerners insisted that the federal government had no right to interfere. Northerners countered that states' rights could not justify violations of basic human freedom. Thus, even the Constitution itself came to be interpreted in radically opposite ways. This divide reached into private life as well. Northern newspapers in Springfield, Boston, and New York published accounts of slavery's cruelty and the testimonies of escaped slaves. Southern papers claimed the North sought to impose its will through force and intimidation. Churches, schools, and family tables became arenas of argument, sometimes dividing relatives against one another. By 1860, America stood on the brink. Decades of disputes had reached a critical point. Political parties split, politicians lost control, and across the country loomed the specter of disunion. The reasons for the Civil War were deeply embedded in the nation's structure, in its economy, morality, human rights, and the very interpretation of its founding laws. Though the cannons were still silent, the road to open conflict was already laid. By the year 1860, tensions between North and South had reached the breaking point. Disputes over slavery, long fought in Congress, in Western territories, and in the press, had turned into an existential conflict over the future of America itself. It became clear that compromise could no longer hold the Union together. In this atmosphere, the presidential election of autumn 1860 took place, the last election of a united America before the war. The central figure was Abraham Lincoln, candidate of the young Republican Party, founded only 6 years earlier. The party did not call for the immediate abolition of slavery in the states where it already existed, but firmly opposed its extension to new territories. For the South, that was enough to brand Lincoln as a mortal threat. Many Southern leaders declared that his victory would mean the end of their participation in the Union. Lincoln won with only about 40% of the popular vote, but secured a solid majority in the Electoral College because the populous North supported him. In most Southern states, his name did not even appear on the ballot. Thus, the new president was elected without a single Southern vote, an event seen not as routine politics but as proof that the South had lost all influence over the Union's destiny. Barely a month later, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede. At a convention in Charleston, delegates voted almost unanimously to dissolve their ties with the United States. Within the next 6 weeks, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They based their action on the idea that the Union was a compact among sovereign states, each free to withdraw at will. In the North, this view was deemed unconstitutional. Most politicians and jurists argued that no state had the right to leave the Union unilaterally. But by early 1861, it was no longer a legal debate. It was reality. A new political entity was forming in the South. In February, at Montgomery, Alabama, delegates formally created the Confederate States of America and adopted a constitution similar to the federal one, except that it explicitly guaranteed slavery as lawful property. Jefferson Davis, a former senator from Mississippi and Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce, was elected president of the Confederacy. Known as a cautious but resolute man, he accepted the post without enthusiasm but immediately began organizing the new government. Meanwhile, outgoing President James Buchanan proved incapable of decisive action. He declared secession unconstitutional, yet claimed the federal government had no authority to stop it by force, a stance that paralyzed Washington. Southern militias seized federal buildings, arsenals, and forts, often without a single shot fired. As Lincoln prepared to take office, his journey from Illinois to Washington became a symbol of the nation's peril. Rumors spread of a plot to assassinate him in Baltimore, and he ultimately arrived secretly at night under guard. On March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as the 16th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he struck a conciliatory tone. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, not to confiscate property, and not to provoke the South. But he firmly stated that secession was illegal and that the government would maintain control over federal property. War could still have been avoided. Many hoped for a new compromise to restore unity. There were even proposals to amend the Constitution to guarantee slavery permanently in existing slave states, a last-ditch effort to win back the seceded South. But it was too late. Trust was gone, and mutual fears had hardened into irreconcilable opposition. Not all Southern states had yet left the Union. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas remained loyal for the moment, hoping the crisis could be resolved peacefully. But as the next chapter will show, their choice would soon be made once war became reality. By the spring of 1861, the United States already had two governments, two presidents, two flags, and two opposing visions of what the Republic was meant to be. The first shot had not yet been fired, but almost everything else had been decided. When Abraham Lincoln took office in March 1861, one question immediately confronted him, a question that would determine the Union's fate. In the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, stood Fort Sumter, a federal fortress now surrounded by Confederate forces. Its garrison of about 80 men, commanded by Major Robert Anderson, a loyal U.S. Army officer from Kentucky, found itself isolated and vulnerable. The fort was cut off from supplies, and the South Carolina militia, now under Confederate command, demanded its evacuation as a violation of their sovereignty. Washington, however, saw it as federal property that could not be surrendered without dishonor. Thus, the fate of a small garrison became the test of two irreconcilable positions: the Union's determination to survive and the Confederacy's resolve to assert its independence. Lincoln faced an impossible dilemma. Ordering evacuation would mean recognizing secession. Sending armed reinforcements would mean starting a war. He chose a middle course, notifying South Carolina that ships would bring food, not troops or weapons, and that any attack on them would be the aggressor's responsibility. This decision proved decisive. Confederate leaders feared that if the fort were resupplied, it would undermine their legitimacy. President Jefferson Davis therefore ordered its capture before relief could arrive. Command in Charleston was given to Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, ironically a former student of Major Anderson at West Point. On April 11th, Confederate envoys demanded the fort's surrender. Anderson refused, stating he would yield only when his supplies were exhausted or upon direct orders from Washington. At about 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the first shot was fired, reportedly by Captain George James from a battery on James Island. For 34 hours, the Confederates bombarded Fort Sumter from land and sea, Anderson's guns replied, but their position made counterfire ineffective and ammunition was running low. Remarkably, no one was killed during the bombardment, though several men were slightly wounded. Realizing resistance was hopeless, Anderson agreed to surrender on April 13th. The terms allowed his men to depart with their flag, weapons, and honors. During the farewell salute on April 14th, however, a powder explosion accidentally killed 2 Union gunners. The first deaths of the war. News of the fall of Fort Sumter spread within a day. In the North, it sparked outrage and patriotic fervor. Crowds filled city squares demanding action. On April 15th, Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion and summoned Congress for an extraordinary July session. That call to arms became the turning point. Seeing that war was inevitable, the remaining Southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, voted to secede and join the Confederacy within weeks. By May of 1861, the Confederacy comprised 11 states, and the front line now ran through the nation's very heart. In both capitals, preparations for war accelerated. In the North, armies were being organized, weapons procured, and factories converted for wartime production. In the South, defenses were built and governments established. In every town, Boston or Richmond, New York or Atlanta, thousands enlisted. Women sewed uniforms, prepared bandages, and organized rallies. Newspapers on both sides printed manifestos, poems, and cartoons urging their readers to stand firm. Few yet grasped the full scale of the coming catastrophe, but everyone understood that the nation had crossed the point of no return. The bombardment of Fort Sumter was not merely the beginning of hostilities. It was the symbolic end of the old America. From that moment on, the struggle was no longer about tariffs or legal amendments, but about the very soul of the Republic. Two Americas, two worlds, two destinies had collided, and their battle would last through long, exhausting, and bloody years. When in April of 1861 the first shots thundered against Fort Sumter, the United States entered a war for which no one was fully prepared. Neither the North nor the South possessed a complete army ready for a large-scale internal conflict. Both sides were forced in haste to create armed forces and to reshape their economies, systems of governance, and transport infrastructure for the needs of war. From the first months, it became clear that the Union and Confederate armies were not merely military formations, but reflections of two entirely different societies, in structure, in resources, and in their view of the world. In the North, the creation of the Army took place under the control of the federal government. After Lincoln's proclamation of April 15, 1861, in which he called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, a mass mobilization began throughout the Union. Recruiting stations from New York to Cincinnati overflowed. In the first weeks, the flow of volunteers was so great that state and local authorities could not keep up with providing men with weapons, uniforms, rations, and training. At the outset, the Union Army consisted of scattered units organized along state lines, with a vast number of untested recruits and officers without combat experience. The core of the officer corps was made up of graduates of the military academy at West Point, though even they were plainly too few. Civilians also entered the ranks, lawyers, engineers, entrepreneurs, who were given commands thanks to political connections or local influence. This often led to problems of discipline and fighting efficiency in the early campaigns. Nevertheless, the North's advantages were evident from the start. The northern states had a population of about 22 million people, whereas the South had around 9 million, of whom roughly 3.5 million were enslaved and not subject to conscription. The North possessed an overwhelming industrial base. More than 80% of all factories, mills, steelworks, and armories lay there. Rail networks, the telegraph, navigable canals, and a developed financial system enabled efficient management of supply, logistics, and communications. Economically, the North was better prepared. Already in 1861, the federal government began issuing national currency, introduced income taxes and tariffs, and commenced the sale of bonds. All this financed military expenditures without destroying the domestic market. Government departments were rapidly adapted to wartime needs, and private factories were retooled to produce uniforms, weapons, artillery, tents, and ammunition. Mills and plants in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois worked especially actively. The South faced a fundamentally different situation. Formally, the Confederacy had a central government in Richmond, but in the first months of the war, each army took shape largely at the initiative of individual states. Soldiers often answered first to their governors rather than to a unified high command. Only by the end of 1861 did a structure subordinated to the Confederate War Department emerge, yet even then, tensions persisted between the center and the regions. Despite scarce resources, the Confederate Army enjoyed a significant advantage in its high command. Many of its generals, Robert Edward Lee, Thomas Jonathan, Stonewall, Jackson, Joseph Eustace Johnston, and Albert Sidney Johnston, were West Point graduates, veterans of the Mexican War, and respected figures among officers. They left the U.S. Army to side with their home states. For many, the choice was not so much political as personal and moral. Loyalty to Virginia, Georgia, or Mississippi was often placed above the oath to the federal government. The South also possessed an edge in fighting spirit. In Southern culture, martial valor, skill with firearms, horsemanship, and hunting were part of daily life. Many recruits had learned to shoot and ride from childhood. This was especially evident in the quality of cavalry units, which in the first years of the war notably outperformed their northern counterparts in speed, mobility, and fieldcraft. For many Southerners, the defense of their land, hometowns, and way of life was perceived as a sacred duty. This mindset lent their troops resilience and cohesion. But these advantages were outweighed by acute shortages. The South lacked heavy industry. Local manufactories could not produce enough rifles, artillery, ammunition, or uniforms. The Army chronically lacked clothing, shoes, and equipment. Many soldiers had no uniform and fought in civilian clothes. Footwear often wore through to rags, and in some units, socks and jackets were passed along from the dead or wounded. The Confederate financial system was unstable. In the absence of a sound currency, the government resorted to issuing unsecured paper money, which quickly led to inflation. Revenues from cotton exports, on which Richmond had counted, collapsed due to the Union naval blockade of southern ports. Trade with Europe became difficult, and deliveries of arms and powder were intermittent. In the long term, the South found itself in a highly vulnerable position. Southern infrastructure also suffered from underdevelopment. Railroads often lacked a standard gauge, complicating troop and freight transport. Telegraph lines covered only limited stretches, and commanders frequently relied on couriers and mounted signal detachments. Army wagon trains moved slowly, and supply in remote areas was poor. Even so, despite these hardships, the Confederacy displayed remarkable endurance, thanks in great part to the organization and charisma of its generals. In the campaigns of 1861 and 1862, Stonewall Jackson became famous for rapid marches, decisive attacks, and the ability to hold a line with minimal forces. His commands marched through the Shenandoah Valley, wore down the Federals with maneuvers, and forced them to keep large forces pinned in defense. These actions showed that the South, despite fewer resources, was capable of initiative and strategic ingenuity. The North, at first, lacked aggressive commanders. General George McClellan, appointed to command the Army of the Potomac, had outstanding administrative gifts and could raise morale, but he suffered from excessive caution and a tendency toward interminable planning. Frustrated by constant postponements, Lincoln began to seek generals willing to assume responsibility and act decisively. Those criteria would later be met by Ulysses Simpson Grant, whose star began to rise after his first successful operations in the West. By the end of 1861, it was clear the war would not end quickly. Two armies, two camps, two methods of warfare had formed on the continent, each with its strengths and weaknesses. The North had the population, industry, and finance. The South had field commanders, fighting spirit, and knowledge of the terrain. Ahead lay a struggle not limited to the number of bayonets or the length of the front. It would touch the very fabric of society, its ideals, its way of life, and its future. When the war began in the spring of 1861, many on both sides of the line believed it would be brief. In the North, they hoped that one or two decisive victories would swiftly crush the rebellion. In the South, they believed that steadfastness and resolve would win recognition of independence. But the first major battles showed that this war would be long, bloody, and transformational for the American nation. The first serious engagement was the Battle of Bull Run, or, as it was called in the South, the Battle of Manassas. It took place on July 21st, 1861, in northern Virginia, roughly 50 kilometers from Washington. The Union Army under General Irvin McDowell marched out from the capital to defeat Confederate forces near the Manassas Junction Railroad Station. The plan envisioned a swift advance, the enemy's route, and an open road to Richmond, the Confederate capital. However, the South managed to shift reinforcements by rail, the first wartime use of rail transport for troop movements, and the battle took an unexpected turn. During fierce fighting on Henry House Hill, the brigade of General Thomas Jackson showed extraordinary steadiness. One Confederate officer cried out, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." Thus was born the nickname Stonewall Jackson, under which the general entered American history. The Union line wavered and began to retreat, which soon turned into a panic-stricken flight, in part under the eyes of curious sightseers from Washington who had come to watch a victory. This defeat shocked the North. For the first time, it became clear that the opponent was not a poorly organized militia, but a highly motivated army with serious commanders. In the South, the victory was taken as proof of strength and of the righteousness of their cause. Yet both sides began to understand that the war would not be quick. In September of 1862 came the bloodiest single day in U.S. history, the Battle of Antietam, called Sharpsburg in the South. General Robert E. Lee's army, invading northern soil for the first time, crossed the Potomac and entered Maryland. Lee hoped for a moral and political effect, perhaps even intervention by Great Britain or France on the Confederacy's side. To intercept Lee, the Union Army under General George McClellan advanced with numerical superiority. The Battle of September 17, 1862, unfolded in three great phases: the morning fight at the cornfield, the savage struggle around the Dunker Church, and the combat at the sunken road, the Bloody Lane, where dozens of assaults broke under a storm of fire. By evening, Lee's army began withdrawing across the Potomac. Tactically, the outcome was ambiguous, but strategically, the North prevailed by halting the invasion. Casualties on both sides exceeded 22,000, a number previously unimaginable. This battle became a turning point. It was after Antietam that Lincoln resolved to announce the preliminary text of the Emancipation Proclamation, which would forever alter the moral character of the war. But more on that in the next chapter. In the spring of 1863, Lee conducted perhaps the boldest operation of the entire war, winning at Chancellorsville. His army, nearly half the size of the Union force under General Joseph Hooker, found itself in a perilous position, yet Lee decided to divide his troops, against conventional military logic. He sent General Thomas Jackson on a flanking march. On May 2nd, 1863, Jackson's attack struck the Federals by surprise, and Hooker's army was defeated. But the victory came at a tragic price. During a nighttime reconnaissance, Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men, who mistook his party for the enemy. A few days later, he died of pneumonia after his arm was amputated. His death was an irreplaceable loss for the Confederacy, militarily and morally. 2 months later came the war's most famous and largest battle, Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. Robert Lee again moved north, hoping to carry the war onto Pennsylvania soil, break the enemy's morale, and force the Washington government to negotiate. But the Union Army under General George Meade took up defensive positions on the hills south of the town of Gettysburg. The 3 days of combat became a slaughter. The third day was especially bloody when Lee ordered General George Pickett to lead a 12,000-man column across open ground into the center of the Union line, the famous Pickett's Charge. Under punishing artillery and musket fire, the Confederate assault reached the enemy's ridge but was almost entirely destroyed. Combined losses exceeded 50,000 men, and Lee was forced to retreat into Virginia. It marked the turning point of the war in the East. From then on, the Confederate Army would never again mount a major offensive on northern soil. At the same time in the West, another decisive event unfolded, the Siege of Vicksburg in the state of Mississippi. The city was the key node on the river that bound the eastern and western parts of the Confederacy. From early spring of 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant conducted an operation to encircle the city. His army advanced through difficult terrain, crossed the Mississippi, won a series of engagements, cut the place off, and began a full siege. By July 4th, 1863, after 47 days, the Confederate garrison commander, General John Pemberton, capitulated. The fall of Vicksburg meant the entire Mississippi River was under Union control. The Confederacy was cut in two, and supplying the Eastern armies became even harder. This victory cemented Grant's reputation as one of the North's most capable generals and presaged his elevation to general-in-chief. Thus, the summer of 1863 became the critical hinge of the war. The twin Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg weakened the Confederacy's strategic position. Northern morale strengthened, confidence in victory grew. In the South, signs of exhaustion intensified. Inflation, food shortages, desertion, and internal discord. Years of fighting, suffering, and destruction still lay ahead. But by then, both sides understood that the war would be waged not only for territory, but for an idea. In the war's early years, Abraham Lincoln avoided open declarations that the conflict's aim was the abolition of slavery. He emphasized that the primary task was to preserve the Union, and that, if leaving slavery untouched were necessary to achieve that, he was prepared to do so. But as the war dragged on, it became ever clearer that one could not fight for a free republic while ignoring the millions denied freedom by birth. After the Union's strategic success at Antietam in September of 1862, which strengthened the North's moral and political position, Lincoln took a decisive step. On September 22, 1862, he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation declaring that if, by January 1, 1863, the rebellious states did not return to the Union, all enslaved people in those territories would be declared free. This was not merely a military or political decision, it was a moral turning point in how the war was understood. On January 1, 1863, the proclamation took effect. It applied only to areas under Confederate control and did not affect slavery in Union-loyal slave states such as Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. Even so, its symbolic power was immense. For the first time, the United States government officially stated that slavery was incompatible with the Republic's foundations. Northern reaction was mixed. Abolitionists, especially Frederick Douglass, welcomed the proclamation as a step they had awaited for decades. Douglass wrote that the war now had a moral purpose, that the fight was not only for the flag, but for human dignity. Yet in some quarters, particularly among immigrant laborers, fears arose that once enslaved people were freed, they would flood northward and compete for jobs. These anxieties, aggravated by the imposition of conscription, erupted into riots in New York in the summer of 1863, in which dozens of African Americans were killed and many buildings burned. In the South, the proclamation was seen as an attempt to incite slave uprisings and to undermine public order. Confederate authorities announced that captured African Americans serving in the Union Army would not be treated as prisoners of war. They were to be returned to slavery, and in case of resistance, could be executed. Nonetheless, news of the proclamation spread quickly through the South, reaching plantations via runaways, Union soldiers, or the occasional leaflet brought by missionaries. For thousands of men and women laboring in the cotton fields, these words were a glimmer of hope. One of the most striking consequences of the proclamation was the enlistment of African Americans into the Union Army. By the spring of 1863, recruitment of black volunteers was well underway. Under policy at the time, segregated regiments were formed with African American enlisted men and white officers. Even so, it was an unprecedented step. Former slaves were becoming defenders of a nation that had so recently denied them rights and citizenship. The most famous unit was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, formed with the support of Governor John Andrew and commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, a white officer from an abolitionist family. On July 18, 1863, during the assault on Fort Wagner near Charleston, the men of the 54th led the attack. Charging head-on against fortified works, they suffered heavy losses yet displayed extraordinary courage. Shaw fell with dozens of his soldiers. Southerners buried him in a mass grave with his men, a gesture they intended as an insult but which became a symbol of unity and sacrifice. Service for African Americans was fraught with hardship. Until the middle of 1864, they were paid less than white soldiers, and only after widespread protests, including by white officers, did Congress equalize pay. They often received inferior equipment, were assigned mostly to labor details, and, if captured, faced the risk of execution. Yet despite these obstacles, by war's end, more than 180,000 African Americans had served in the Union Army, with about 18,000 more in the Navy, roughly 10% of all Union forces. Their participation had not only military value but profound symbolic weight. Dispatches, soldiers' letters, and newspaper reports increasingly emphasized that these men not only fought bravely, but helped reimagine the essence of American democracy. Many white soldiers, serving beside African Americans at the front, attested to their courage, stamina, and resolve. Stereotypes were broken not by politicians' speeches, but by shared experience in battle. The Emancipation Proclamation also proved pivotal in foreign policy. Until 1863, the governments of Great Britain and France maintained cautious neutrality, leaving open the possibility of recognizing the Confederacy. But once the war was officially framed as a struggle against slavery, diplomatic support for the South became politically impossible, especially in Britain, where abolitionism enjoyed broad public backing. Thus, the proclamation strengthened the Union's international position and dashed Richmond's hopes for external aid. It is important to remember that the proclamation did not abolish slavery entirely. For its final eradication, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was required, achieved only in December of 1865. But January 1st, 1863 was the day when America officially changed course. From then on, the war was waged not only for the Union's restoration, but for a redefinition of freedom and citizenship themselves. Prolonged battles, marches, ruined cities, and thousands of deaths still lay ahead. Yet both North and South already understood. If the Union prevailed, it would be a different country, one in which freedom would no longer be a privilege assigned by skin color, but the foundation of a new American identity. By the beginning of 1864, the American Civil War had been raging for almost 3 years. Despite the Union's major victories in 1863, at Gettysburg and at Vicksburg, the Confederacy remained combat capable, especially in the East. General Robert Edward Lee's army still held Virginia, and in the South, there persisted a hope that the North would tire of fighting and agree to negotiations. At precisely this moment, Washington adopted a strategic decision. Victory would not come from a single battle, but only through systematic and ubiquitous pressure on the entire military and economic potential of the South. In the spring of 1864, Abraham Lincoln appointed Ulysses Simpson Grant General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant, a laconic, straightforward man, had already earned fame through victories in the Western Theater, especially at Shiloh and at Vicksburg. He now designed a coordinated strategy in which Union armies would advance simultaneously on every front, denying the Confederacy the chance to regroup and maneuver. Grant personally took command of the Army of the Potomac and opened his offensive against Lee in Virginia, the so-called Overland Campaign. In May and June of 1864 came the brutal battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, and Cold Harbor. Casualties were colossal on both sides, especially for the Union. Grant did not seek a quick triumph. His strategy was constant pressure and attrition. He said, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." In June, he reached Petersburg, south of Richmond, and began a siege that lasted more than 9 months. Meanwhile, in the West, General William Tecumseh Sherman moved. In the spring of 1864, he advanced from Chattanooga toward Atlanta, a key Confederate railroad and industrial hub. Opposing him stood General Joseph E. Johnston, experienced but cautious. Sherman used flanking movements and maneuvers, forcing the enemy to yield ground step by step. In July, dissatisfied with the slow pace, Confederate President Jefferson Davis replaced Johnston with the more aggressive but less prudent General John Bell Hood, whose frontal attacks produced grievous losses. On September 2, 1864, Atlanta fell to Sherman's army. The event proved decisive for Northern morale and for politics in general. The presidential election loomed in November, and before Atlanta's capture, Lincoln's position had been weak. The victory renewed faith that the war could end. Lincoln was reelected with the support of a majority of northern states. Sherman then began his famous March to the Sea, leaving Atlanta behind and moving southeast toward Savannah. His force of about 60,000 men traversed Georgia, wrecking infrastructure, food depots, railroads, and telegraph lines. In official reports, the strategy was called the destruction of resources that sustained the Confederacy's war effort. But for the local population, the march became a synonym for total collapse. Sherman sought to avoid needless cruelty. He forbade looting and punished violence against civilians. Yet the army often operated autonomously, especially on the fringes. On December 21, 1864, Savannah capitulated, and Sherman presented the city to Lincoln as a symbolic gift, accompanying it with a telegram. "Mr. President, I have the honor to present to you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 guns and about 25,000 bales of cotton." In the spring of 1865, Sherman pushed on through South and North Carolina, destroying what remained of Confederate infrastructure and extinguishing the South's last hope of resistance. Meanwhile, Grant continued the Petersburg siege, and Lee's army grew ever more desperate: food shortages, desertion, and collapsing morale. On March 25, 1865, Lee launched a final breakout attempt at Fort Stedman, but the attack failed. On April 2nd, Grant broke through the Petersburg lines. On April 3rd, Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell. Jefferson Davis's government fled a city gripped by fire and chaos. Lee tried to retreat westward, hoping to join Johnston's army in North Carolina. But Grant, anticipating the maneuver, blocked the route and began a relentless pursuit. There were no conditions left for escape. On April 9, 1865, in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee decided to surrender. The capitulation took place in the home of a local resident, Wilmer McLean, who, ironically, had lived in Manassas in 1861, site of the war's first major battle, and had since moved to get away from the front. There Lee and Grant met. Grant wore a simple field uniform. Lee was in full dress. The negotiations were calm. Grant offered generous terms. Officers could keep their sidearms. Enlisted men could take their horses for the spring planting. Lee accepted without objection. He was exhausted yet dignified. His army, by then numbering fewer than 30,000 men, laid down its arms. The next morning, the disarmament ceremony began. As Lee's troops marched past the Union lines, the federal commander on the scene, General Joshua Chamberlain, on his own initiative, ordered a salute of arms to the vanquished, a gesture of respect and reconciliation. Southerners were stunned. It signaled that, after all the horrors, a time of healing, not vengeance, was beginning. Although some Confederate forces continued to fight for a short while, Johnston's army surrendered only on April 26th, and far-flung trans-Mississippi garrisons in June. Lee's capitulation marked the war's effective end. The Confederacy was defeated, politically and militarily. The North had won, but at a price the nation had yet to comprehend. Nearly 750,000 dead, a ravaged South, and millions of lives forever altered. And even as the country braced for the next chapter, post-war rebuilding and a rethinking of values, tragedy struck first: the loss of the man who had led it through its darkest trial. When on April 9, 1865, General Robert Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln finally allowed himself to breathe out. In the war's last months, he had scarcely slept, monitoring the fronts, receiving reports, conferring with generals and cabinet members. Victory seemed within arm's length, but not in the form he had envisioned. From the beginning, Lincoln saw the Civil War not only as armed conflict, but as a moral test. Now, as the Confederate Army yielded, he spoke not of retribution, but of mercy. He longed for reunion. "We must not punish the South. We must restore it to the Union," he repeated. His idea was to rebuild through forgiveness, not humiliation. In his speeches, he appealed to compassion and equality, even knowing not all would accept those words. In the last days of his life, he looked tired, yet inwardly unburdened. He told friends he had slept well for the first time in weeks. He spoke of going to California, of returning to his home in Springfield, of ordinary, peaceful life after long years of war. On Friday, April 14th, 1865, the anniversary week of Fort Sumter's fall, the war's symbolic beginning, Lincoln chose to spend the evening at Ford's Theater. The popular comedy Our American Cousin was playing, and the president and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, invited a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, to share their box. For Lincoln, it was a gesture of return to normal life, a sign that citizens could again go to the theater without thinking of battlefronts. That night, the house was full. The audience greeted the president warmly with applause. No one noticed when, around 10 o'clock in the evening, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and fanatical Southern sympathizer, entered the building. He knew the theater well, having performed there many times. Booth believed fervently that Lincoln's assassination would change history, restore Southern honor, and inspire remaining Confederate forces to continue the fight. He acted as part of a conspiracy. That same night, his accomplices were to attack Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. At about 10:15 p.m., during a particularly uproarious scene, Booth quietly opened the door to Lincoln's box, stepped inside, and fired a shot into the president's head at close range. He then slashed Major Rathbone with a knife, leapt from the box to the stage, shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," and fled backstage. He broke his leg in the fall, but still managed to escape the building. Lincoln was carried across the street to 516 Pennsylvania Avenue to the house of Taylor William Peterson. There, in a back bedroom, on a bed too short for his tall frame, he passed his final hours. The doctors, upon examining the wound, knew at once he could not be saved. The bullet had passed through his skull and lodged behind his right eye. The president died the next morning, April 15th at 7:22, surrounded by family, cabinet members, and officers. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said then, "Now he belongs to the ages." News of the assassination swept the country with astonishing speed. Washington entered mourning, black crepe on doors, tolling bells, flags at half-staff. In the great cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, crowds gathered at newspaper stands hungry for extra editions. Funeral hymns sounded in the streets. Churches opened for public prayer. Even in southern states, where Lincoln had been hated, many met the tidings with stunned silence. The nation had lost the one man who might have bridged past and future. Lincoln's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, where tens of thousands came to pay respects. Then began the funeral tour, among the most extensive mourning processions in U.S. history. The coffin traveled to Springfield, Illinois. Retracing in reverse the route Lincoln had taken in 1861 to his inauguration, the train stopped in major cities. Along the tracks, people waited for hours in silence, holding candles, while funeral bands played. On May 4th, 1865, Lincoln was buried in Springfield, in a modest tomb at Oak Ridge Cemetery. Thousands came to say farewell. His wife Mary and 3 of their sons would later be laid to rest beside him. For the nation, it was not merely a farewell to a president. It was a farewell to an era. Meanwhile, John Wilkes Booth was on the run. Hundreds of soldiers hunted him. He fled southward, hid in woods, and received help from sympathizers. 12 days later, he was found at Richard Garrett's farm in Virginia. He refused to surrender. The barn in which he hid was set ablaze, and in the ensuing gunfire, Booth received a mortal wound. His last words were, "Useless, useless." With Lincoln's death, the figure vanished who might have guided the country along a gentler path to reunion. His successor, Andrew Johnson, inherited the office but lacked his predecessor's authority and wisdom. Ahead lay a long and painful process: Reconstruction, the restoration of the nation, the rebuilding of trust, and the determination of what the new American order would be after war and slavery. When the war ended and the last guns fell silent, the United States faced a task no republic had ever solved: how to restore a nation torn in two and build a common future for those who had only yesterday fought each other. Reconstruction meant not only repairing the South's ruined cities, but far more important, creating a new political, legal, and social order in which victors and vanquished, the free and the newly freed, would have to live together. President Abraham Lincoln had begun to ponder Reconstruction during his lifetime. He envisioned a gentle return of the South to the Union and believed peace should rest on reconciliation, not revenge. But in April of 1865, only days after General Lee's surrender, he was murdered. His successor was Andrew Johnson, a Southerner by birth, a politician of difficult temperament and narrow views on racial and social questions. He had supported the Union but believed Reconstruction should be swift, simple, and without far-reaching change. During the summer and autumn of 1865, Johnson issued dozens of pardons to former Confederates and allowed Southern states to form new governments. Yet these governments differed little from their predecessors. Legislatures again filled with former planters, generals, and Confederate politicians. They enacted the so-called Black Codes, local laws that restricted the rights of the freed people, barring free movement, choice of work, access to the courts, possession of arms, and the vote. In effect, many were driven back into dependency scarcely distinguishable from slavery in all but name. In the North, outrage mounted. Radical Republicans in Congress, notably Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and others, declared that Johnson's policy was leading the nation into repeated error. They pressed for tighter federal control over the South. In 1866, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau to aid the formerly enslaved, distributing food and clothing, providing medical care, opening schools, and protecting legal rights. The Bureau's head, General Oliver Howard, personally oversaw the creation of educational institutions, including what would become Howard University in Washington. At the same time, work began to change the Constitution itself. In December of 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. In 1868 came the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship to all born in the country and forbidding states to deny anyone equal protection of the laws. Finally, in 1870, the 15th Amendment barred denial of the vote on the basis of race. Southern resistance only grew. Local white elites would not accept the loss of power. By 1866, paramilitary groups had arisen, the most notorious being the Ku Klux Klan. These organizations terrorized black citizens and their allies, attacked schools and polling places, and targeted the homes of activists. Violence became part of politics. Voters were beaten, sometimes killed, to prevent ballots for Republican candidates. Even so, the early years of Reconstruction saw unprecedented change. For the first time in U.S. history, former slaves received education, registered to vote, and won seats in local and even federal government. Southern states saw racially mixed legislatures with black and white members. In 1870, Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black U.S. senator. Across many counties, the first public schools opened and roads, bridges, and hospitals began to be built. Yet Reconstruction was not only reform, it was also a battlefield of clashing interests. By the early 1870s, the North was weary of confrontation. The war had ended, and the financial panic of 1873 shifted attention to economic hardship. Many began to see Reconstruction as costly, confusing, and futile. In 1876, after a disputed presidential election, a compromise was struck between Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats. Republican Rutherford Hayes would become president, and in exchange, federal troops would withdraw from the Southern states. With the soldiers' departure, Reconstruction ended. Southern governments at once moved to restore a system grounded in racial inequality. Black officials were expelled from office, voting rights were stripped by poll taxes, literacy tests and other devices. Segregation laws were enacted. Thus began the Jim Crow era, which would last until the middle of the 20th century. Reconstruction failed in its central task, to secure equal rights for all Americans. Yet it left a vital legacy. The new constitutional amendments became the foundation of future civil rights struggles, the legal bedrock for Martin Luther King, for desegregation, and for a fuller realization of democratic principles. These years were the nation's first, and very difficult, attempt to build a multiracial democracy. Today, looking back, we see how many errors and losses there were, how much was squandered through fear, hatred, and political calculation. But we also see how, for the first time, millions who had once had no legal name gained the chance to speak, to learn, and to vote. That chance became the point from which began a slow and painful yet irreversible journey toward freedom. The American Civil War was not merely an armed clash between North and South, nor only a struggle for economic and political dominance. It was a profound moral crisis in which the nation had to answer whether it could truly live up to its proclaimed ideals of liberty, equality, and human rights. Never before, neither before nor since, has a conflict of such destructive force been fought on U.S. soil. In 4 years of war, more than 120,000 people died. Cities were ruined, plantations burned, resources drained, and above all, the very essence of the American state was transformed. Slavery was formally abolished, but the road to genuine equality had only begun. Northern victory meant the Union's preservation, but not the automatic triumph of justice. Reconstruction, riddled with contradictions and compromises, revealed how painful and fragile the passage from one historical order to another could be. The freed people gained formal rights, yet soon faced new forms of oppression. Not legal, but economic and social. Congressional reforms, Southern resistance, the rise of racial hatred, and the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan made Reconstruction an era of hope and of fierce moral and political struggle. Yet it was precisely in those years, in army camps, in makeshift schools, in the halls of Southern legislatures, that the groundwork of the American civic idea was laid. The constitutional amendments of that era reshaped the very meanings of citizenship, equality, and rights. They were not realized at once or in full, but decades later they became supports for the civil rights movement, for the fight against segregation, and for the assertion of democratic principles in the fullest sense. The memory of the Civil War remains a living part of American identity. Its traces linger in street and school names, in monuments and flags, in curricula and public debate. The war has not vanished into the irretrievable past. It continues to shape the cultural and political climate, inspiring discussions about justice, historical guilt, and national memory. It is important to remember that this war's history was written not only by generals, presidents, and legislators. It was written by thousands upon thousands, soldiers and farmers, the enslaved and teachers, women and children, the wounded and refugees, all those whose names did not endure in the books, but whose lives together form the portrait of an age. Thanks to their effort, their suffering, and their hopes, the country did not fall apart, but set out on the path of reimagining itself. The Civil War did not conclude American history, but it made that history irreversibly different. And perhaps, in acknowledging this national trauma, lies the true birth of modern America, a country forced to face its own contradictions, to pass through pain and ruin in order to move closer to its own ideals.